Hi, everybody. Blessings of the season to you all. In the Northern Hemisphere, we just celebrated Beltane, and of course, Southern Hemisphere is celebrating Samhain. So, really, two of my favorite fire festivals, either way. So, hope you all enjoyed your celebration and are ready to move into the next part of the year. I'm going to do one more on judgment. This is going to be the hardest one for me since it is going to, I'm going to use my own experience to illustrate the concept of judging oneself. And I've had to learn these the hard way, mostly. And I'm just hoping that for somebody else it may open the way to an easier path than the one that I took to truth. So to summarize so far, we've seen judging others. Of course, you can only judge their actions and their words, the way that it impacts your own journey, and that's either with the view of receiving it. If it's criticism, it can be constructive, and if we receive it and benefit from it, then that's great. Or reject it, depending if it came from a place of spite or whatever in their on their part, then we know we can safely reject that. So that's the limit of our right to judge others, essentially. They are on their own journey, and we have enough to deal with ourselves. And then we also covered judging other creatures. So, whatever we see, even in negative ways around us, weeds, we talked about dandelions, but also, things like bugs or snakes or things that we are often instinctively afraid of. For me, that would be spiders. But in judging those, we may see them as negative, but it's usually from an emotional standpoint. It's not a judgment that is fair to them. Everything that lives on this planet has a purpose and has a way that they serve other lives, no matter how icky they may be to us. So bringing it back to judging oneself, that's a balancing act. And I have taken almost 50 years to even learn that much. Society does this undulation thing, which I've mentioned before, just going from one extreme to the opposite, with judgment in general, but also many societal trends will go that way. Judgment, in particular, some of that is generational, and we're always going to see that. Every new generation likes to criticize the one before, and every preceding generation criticizes the younger one. So that's just a human thing. So there is fallout for any judgment that we make, including on ourselves. And so we have to be very, very careful. Something I did not realize until far too late, in my opinion. But there's always a danger of falling into whatever the societal trend is at that time. For example, in the early 1700s, I'm going way back because this is not something anyone can take personally, hopefully, to Jonathan Edwards. He was this famous fire and brimstone preacher who traveled around I forget exactly where his boundaries were, but he traveled around on the East Coast and skyrocketed in popularity because of this sermon, his famous sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. And it's exactly what it sounds like. It's based on fear, and it was to condemn people and cause them to condemn themselves to the point that they saw their danger of hellfire. They saw that they deserved to go to hell in the view of this holy God. So it was quite successful at the time in changing people's behavior to perhaps higher moral standards, certainly by Christianity's standards, which to me are questionable. But he was very effective because he was so charismatic. He was so passionate in teaching people to judge themselves harshly, because God was absolutely going to judge them even more harshly. And if we judged ourselves enough to repent, his view was that people would be saved from hellfire. So you can argue that his motivation was was good. I'm not going to argue that because I frankly don't like him. There are a lot of people in history that I don't like anymore. Looking at you, St. Patrick. Anyway, so this is where we get the descriptive, fire and brimstone preaching. A lot of preachers have done that, and not just in Christianity. Again, this is a human thing. It's not confined to one specific religion or culture. So he was using fear to generate self-judgment in his listeners in the harshest way, and emphasizing our inability as humans to measure up to any standard of perfection. Yet, as humans, we can envision a perfect standard, a standard of perfection, and recognize that we can never reach it. So it's an interesting dichotomy there. But church attendance, skyrocketed, and religious fervor was certainly revived at the time because he was so effective in getting people to judge themselves harshly. And I'm using him as an extreme example of the judgmentalism that society periodically adopts towards the self. And now, I'm also using him in part because we are now at the opposite extreme, I believe. We have embraced the love of the self, which is great, as a prerequisite to loving others properly. Properly and fully. And I do believe that to be the case. However, we have taken it so far, we've overcorrected, and that becomes equally damaging, creating little herds of just miniature narcissists running around and caring about nothing but themselves and ourselves. I've been one of those. So there's this indifference to others that is bred by this kind of unhealthy self-love. Self-love to the exclusion of other creatures and other lives. And we lose perspective when we lose the ability to empathize, when we don't understand where others are coming from, because we're so obsessed with ourselves, and everybody should be coming from where we're coming from. So we lose perspective of our impact on the lives of others around us because we just think that all that counts is ourselves and our love of ourselves. So, my life, as an example, it begins with Jonathan Edwards. Really, I've mentioned before, I grew up in a fundamentalist cult. It was very cold and unloving. I was repeatedly told as a child, before I was 10 even, I was always told that I was possessed by a demon of rebellion. And this was every time I dared to ask a question about dogma or ethics, or if I disagreed or hinted that I might disagree in the vaguest way with any adult, especially my parents and their pastor, and on through every adult in the entire congregation. there were beautiful people even there, some of whom I still love to this day, but it was an extremely toxic environment that preached self-hatred, and I learned it very well. Um, Back then, in that time and place, at least for me, rebellion wasn't a cool thing like it's become in society. Rebellion was one of the worst sins, tied to pride, tied to witchcraft, with no redeeming qualities whatsoever. Of course, now I am a witch, so I don't mind, and I am a rebel. I don't mind the label now, but growing up, it was terrifying to think that I might fit this description. And they would threaten me with exorcisms. It was just ridiculous growing up. So, yeah, exorcism was proposed, and I did love my parents, of course, and I wanted to make them happy and proud. So I learned very early that I was going to repress anything inside me that might contradict what I was taught at church or at home. At the same time, they would encourage me to doubt everything said by the heathens at public school. The teachers, the principal, their judgment was not trusted because they weren't part of the cult. So eventually they fixed that because they forced me to be homeschooled for my high school years. And there was a lot that I learned from that, but I wouldn't wish it on my worst enemy the whole way I grew up. So, anytime I received a compliment as a kid, my mother was really quick to warn me against taking pride in it, because pride was, the sin of Satan, along with rebellion. So whether it was my physical appearance that was being complimented as I grew into adolescence, or achievements in school, I was in the gifted and talented program, and yeah, that ended up not doing much for me, because it was the fact that I was in the talented and gifted program, to me, was exciting, but to my parents it was a danger of pride, that I would take pride in my intellect and not believe what was taught at church. Well, obviously their fears were grounded there. So pride and rebellion, the sins of Satan. So if I were to take even a moment's pleasure in any success that I had, getting a good grade, or whatever achievement, it was offensive to God automatically that I took pride in it, because anything good came from Him and was did not belong to me as a sinner. So all of this naturally results in creating a version of me who is so desperately afraid of being happy, except in church or for the achievements of others, that those were safe to be happy about. But to take happy, whether I was happy because I did well in a class, or if I got a compliment on a sketch I drew, I would instantly reject it and immediately talk about how untalented and hideous and horrible I actually was, because that was my way of avoiding hellfire, essentially. So one example I really remember clearly to this day is in mid-adolescence, probably about 15 years old. My grandmother tried to warn me to be cautious, since she saw that my physical beauty was growing as I was in middle adolescence. And she wanted to warn me that, others could want to exploit it, and I could get hurt because of it, which I think is an important warning. Certainly I gave that warning to my children. But my mother heard this and just went ballistic. She immediately yelled at her mother, my grandmother, for catering to my vanity and encouraging pridefulness in me. And, all of this is to just illustrate from a personal perspective how afraid I was. I was terrified of ever feeling good about myself in any way. That was the road to hell, and being tortured forever in a lake of fire by a God of love. This is the confusing way that I was brought up. So, needless to say, this all made me really vulnerable to compliments on several levels. It was such a maze, just navigating compliments and everyday things that are probably normal to most people. It was treacherous to me. And the turning point for me came with my conversion to pagan drudgery. And when I finally stopped trying to please my parents, stopped trying to please my first husband and all of the church authority figures that I'd grown up being, I grew up and they were attempting exorcisms on me. So, it was expected that I would just shit on myself constantly shitting on myself in order to guard against any possibility of vanity or pride. So when I left that whole way of thinking and started my pagan path, I lost all of my church friends, most of my Christian friends, and most of my family. So I was really afraid at first, and then I wasn't, because it just was such a delightful, interesting journey that I knew was absolutely meant for me. So learning to love myself was part of this journey, and it was one of the most challenging things I had to learn. Very long process. It was a joyous time, and I wish I could go back to those years in many ways. However, the opposite extreme of what I grew up with did eventually catch up with me, because I did not properly learn to be really comfortable with what was a healthy self-love. I didn't fully understand it, and didn't realize that my understanding was lacking. So I ended up catering to myself to the absolute exclusion of considering other people, even those closest to me. And I ended up doing very unwarranted damage to really good people because of that. My second husband, for example, was really good guy, and I ended up being very treacherous and cruel, and that was not what I intended. But my belief that only I mattered, my feelings mattered more than anything, and so that led me to start hurting other people, because it was me to the exclusion of all else. And if I have to step on you to get what I want, I will do it. And that is not healthy self-love. And I was lacking in judging myself appropriately, but I didn't realize it. So ended up losing most of my family again. This time my children, there was a lot of difficulty with them, because I started to struggle with addiction issues, because just nothing made me happy, and I was in the throes of pain, and this cycle of pain, and then bitterness and selfishness, and just on and on. I had a back injury, and then it just deteriorated from there. I expected everyone to cater to me, because I learned to love myself, and I thought everybody should love me like that. So I ended up in a very sharp, painful karmic lesson, totally deserved, totally earned. I earned some really painful karma, and again lost everything. Extremely selfish choices led me to the greatest loss of my life. And I just became toxically self-absorbed, and that brought me to rock bottom in a way nothing else could. And I eventually was just bitter that I was ever born at all, that I had to exist in any form. I did not want consciousness. I didn't want any of this. And some of that still comes back once in a while, to be perfectly honest. I still do struggle with that occasionally. When things are dark and difficult, it becomes difficult not to be bitter. I did overcome my addictions with the help of my patron and patroness deities, Morrigan being most helpful among them. So sorry, I lost my place, and I don't want to miss anything important on this. Yeah, so the whole struggle with addiction for me was that I wanted to numb my pain at any cost. There was so much pain, and I couldn't deal with it. So it was just anything that would make it numb and make it stop hurting, even temporarily, was my priority. And that is a really, really sad and terrible, fearful way to live. It's not living, really, it's existing. So I was too, afraid of facing more pain to take any drastic action to try and self-correct for a long time, and ended up in a severe breakdown. But then finally, in my latest, most recent Phoenix experience, I let it all burn, all of it, from the beginning to the end. And I have taken, I hope, only the jewels out of the ashes with me on the rest of my journey. And one of those jewels is a balanced self-love. I see my struggles. I understand my inner child. I forgive myself for the ways that I fail. And I also take joy and pride in the things I do well. I recognize my talents. I recognize my gifts, and I am grateful for them, and I enjoy them. I enjoy myself. I enjoy my own company, which is something completely alien to the way that I grew up. So, yeah, I am an amazing soul. That's my essence, and I have learned to actually appreciate and love that essence. But because I do love myself that well, I recognize also my weaknesses and how I'm prone to failing others, or just learning to be careful in how I treat others, using a lot more caution, knowing that the ways I'm most likely to do harm, I can cut it off at the pass a lot of times. So I judge my own thoughts towards others, evaluating whether those thoughts are worthy of expression. Are they the thoughts that a good person should be having of others? If not, if I see cruelty or apathy or arrogance in my thoughts toward others, I strive to correct myself right there and then. And that way it has no chance to grow into these cruel words or arrogant actions that really cause damage to other people involved. If I do that, if I judge what nobody else sees, in other words, my thoughts, my attitudes, my feelings, then my conscience will be clear when it comes to my motivation for external words and deeds. Of course, I'm still going to screw it up and hurt people without meaning to, but that's an entirely different ballgame. So if I do cause offense to others, I can be humble and I can be quick to apologize when it's called for, as it is on occasion and often. But in loving myself, I can also absolve myself sometimes to the extent that their judgment is inappropriate, or I stand up for myself if I see that I'm the one being wronged. So if we learn to judge ourselves appropriately and with balance, with both love and the light of honesty, nobody else is going to find that much to legitimately judge us for externally. So in learning to judge ourselves, we see when others cross the line in judging us unfairly, and we learn to reject that judgment and move on, and it doesn't have an impact on us. So self-judgment also gives us that gift. It goes hand in hand with self-love, and that in turn leads to this natural ability to give judgment externally to the self with love automatically. So that way we're not naturally going to judge with cruelty or inappropriately. Judgment of any kind must come from a place of love first. In order for it to be legitimate or helpful, it must come from love. It must not come from fear, or fear will taint everything from that point. Fear is antithetical to love. We have to choose to be rooted in love, or we are going to find fear and the taint of that inescapable in everything that we do and say. So I hope that's it. And I think we'll be done with judging as a topic. Moving forward, it's probably going to be the balance of opposites, because that's kind of a very broad spectrum subject that impacts everything else. But anyway, hope you guys have a great week, and see you later.